This story begins in the evening, as the sun is already sinking below the horizon. There were many people in the hall, and a man was sitting on his throne. Another man stood in front of him and told him the whole situation. When he finished his speech, he asked His Majesty what his decision would be. The emperor named Michael Sonnet Devran pondered the decision, and afterwards sternly said that the apology he demanded changes. The people present were shocked by what they heard. They immediately began to whisper among themselves, discussing these words. But at that moment, a girl with hair as red as roses spoke. She was the emperor's secretary, and her name was Letitia Woods. The girl said that His Majesty had ordered to check on Duke Ruscarol. After that, she began to study the papers. Then she handed the papers to the emperor. Thereupon, Letitia addressed the guests and said that the Navy's equipment needs to be improved. The people were shocked. However, she continued and said that if the kingdom of Tetham showed disobedience, then His Majesty orders the destruction of their fleet. After a while it was over and people started to go outside discussing everything that had happened. One of the men exhaled lightly and said that thankfully, this time it was without any deaths. The other agreed with him and said that everyone was being cautious now, after the Chancellor, who had gone against the Emperor's will, lost his head. And probably if it weren't for the secretary, the Empire would have easily fallen into chaos. At that moment, the two of them looked at the girl who was standing nearby. But then the older man shook his head unhappily and said that she was some kind of commoner after all. Then another guest came up to them and said that everything came from Eost, from the sentences of the aristocrat finished imperial family. That's because no one in high places can even get a word in edgewise. However, another man told them to watch their speech, for even walls have ears, and they could get in big trouble for saying such things. However, they continued talking, and the man said that if she translated well, her background didn't matter. She was the only one in the Empire who could listen to His Majesty's speech. After all, he's been speechless for a long 10 years, and he thinks she knows and handles her responsibilities perfectly. At this point, Letitia was walking down the hallway after the meeting was over, and thought she was very overworked from last night. There was a young boy walking beside the girl. He asked that he himself hand over the documents to His Majesty, and she at least get some rest. She turned to him and, smiling, told him that things were going downhill without her, so she couldn't do it. The lad replied that he had heard that she had stayed by His Majesty's side for 10 years, helping him. That is worthy of respect. Letitia sternly told him to leave this useless chatter, and asked that he provide her with the documents with the wrong calculations. The guy was surprised, but he said he would drop them off at His Majesty's office. The girl immediately thanked him and started to go about her business. The girl walked through the empty corridors of the manor. It was getting dark outside, but they hadn't turned on the lights yet, she told herself, becoming much quieter after all the guests had left. But then the girl accidentally threw herself over her own foot and started to fall. However, Letitia still managed not to fall because her man picked her up by the arm. The girl did not expect this. When she looked at the man, she was very frightened, and immediately started to move away. It was the Emperor. He said only one word: equilibrium. Letitia told him not to worry, for she had rested enough. She then started handing over the documents and said they were for verification. There was a list of names and titles of the officials involved. Then the Emperor was about to open the door. He turned to the girl and said, "Needle." He is a man with an angelic face, a tyrant feared by the Empire and the entire continent. Barely ascending the throne, he stained the imperial castle with blood, killing many aristocrats and servants. That's how he was nicknamed the bloodthirsty tyrant. He is the worst ruler in the history of the Empire. Every time the fate of people with her own words, the girl was terribly tormented. But for Letitia, it would soon be over, and she would no longer have to suffer. They went into his office, and the man put some books on the table. After that he said, "Cat." The girl thanked him and said she would stand. Then she turned to him. Letitia was uneasy and nervous, but then she said that she had something urgent to tell him. The girl clenched her hand into a fist and quickly said she was sorry to report so suddenly, but she wanted to quit by the end of the year. Mikael was shocked. However, he didn't say anything. Then the girl continued and said that that was why she needed to find candidates as early as possible and select a qualified person. And at that moment, a man walked up to her and gave her a quick hug. Letitia was shocked. She wanted to pull away, but he squeezed even tighter. And then quietly but confidently, he said, asking the girl to stay with him. Letitia was in shock. She began to shake with fear. It was the first time she had heard the Emperor say the words. The girl wondered, and how long ago he had been able to speak. The Emperor was addressing her. However, the girl closed her eyes and fell unconscious. She didn't know how long it had been since he had learned to speak normally, so she was shocked. After this incident, the girl after a while started to open her eyes because the bright sun woke her up. The girl, when she realized it was morning, woke up quickly. She was frightened, but then she heard someone calling her name. Letitia turned her head to the side and saw His Majesty. The girl was surprised, but after a while she anxiously asked where she was and panickedly started looking around. At that moment, Mikael moved so close to the girl that she could feel his breath and touched his forehead to hers. Letitia's breath caught, but the man quickly pulled back and said she had no fever. After that, he started to walk away. The girl was confused. She didn't understand what was happening and wanted answers. Mikael paused for a second before walking out, however, and said that nothing would happen if they talked when she was rested. Then the door slammed shut, and the girl was alone in the room. Letitia sat on the bed and looked out the window, wondering when everything had gone wrong. One question kept plaguing her. If she hadn't met Mikael that night, what would have changed? Well, 11 years before all these events, Letitia was still very young and lived in a town that was deep in the woods. One day the girl woke up and was already doing her usual activities. She got up, put on her apron, and immediately went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. This day it was a very appetizing soup. Then the girl went upstairs and knocked on the wooden door. She turned to her mother and father and told them to wake up because breakfast was ready. Then the sleepy parents left the room and went down to the kitchen. When they saw the girl, they immediately wished her good morning. Letitia, seeing her mom, told them to eat while everything was hot. She had also made sandwiches for them to take with them. The woman was surprised, but she thanked her daughter for it. When they sat down at the table, the young guy tasted a spoonful of soup, said it was cabbage soup again, and that he just hated it. However, Letitia wished them all a pleasant appetite. Then the father spoke and asked the girl if she had taken care of the food for her grandmother. Letitia replied that as soon as she had made herself ready, she took her to her room at once. But at that moment her mother spoke and asked her if it was not already time for her to go in that case. When the girl stood up and picked up the bowl of cloth, saying that of course she had to go now. After that she started to leave and told Mom and Dad to be careful on the way. Mom said they'd be careful for sure, but let her be careful too. Then the girl went into town to the market, which was organized there every day. The weather was warm and sunny outside, so it was nice to go for a walk. As soon as she entered the market area, one of the vendors turned around and cheerfully said that it was Letitia after all, and 2 women were passing by, and one of them asked the girl if she was still going to the mountains today. Letitia smiled and told her aunt that was right, and it was a beautiful morning. Then the woman asked, she must be going to get a lie for her grandmother. And then the other one added that she works so hard every day. Her parents must be very proud of her. The girl got a little embarrassed and said it was no big deal. If not her, who would do it? Then an elderly lady came up to her and said she was very jealous of the Woods couple. And a man who was passing by said that he too would like his little girl to labor at least half that way. Then Letitia went on and thought that on this day she would fill the basket to the brim. Then both her parents and grandmother would be pleased. After a while, the girl finally reached the mountains. However, that sunny weather was spoiled in an instant, and it began to rain heavily. Letitia began to pluck the blades of grass she needed for her grandmother. She was very cold because the rain had made the wind strong. She hadn't even expected it to rain this hard, but she still shouldn't go back. She looked in the basket and noticed that she had only found 3 pieces. Mommy and Daddy would be very disappointed if she came back like that. Letitia realized that it wasn't time yet, so she must dig out soon and go. The girl set to work. But whatever petal she picked up, it wasn't the same. She needed Severin, but she couldn't find it. The girl decided she needed to get ready right away because Mom and Dad were still working for them. She would definitely need to find a healing herb. She imagined bringing them a few petals of the herb. Mom, of course, patted her on the head and told her not to apologize because that was enough. However, the father will be mesmerized. He will say that this is too little to prepare a cure for his mother, and a doctor will have to be called. But at that moment, Letitia was interrupted from her musings by a strange sound in the depths of the forest. She did not know what it was. And then she thought it was probably a bear. They'd been in the woods since before she was born. Hunter Uncle Swanson was telling her that he had found a deer that had died a horrible death. There were also huge claw marks. The girl thought she was finished, because the sounds were getting closer and closer. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, but when she realized that nothing was happening, she opened them immediately. Letitia looked straight in front of her and saw a small child. It was a boy with blonde hair and eyes that looked like he was scared. After calming down a bit, she asked the boy who he was and where his parents were now. The kid didn't say anything back. He was upset and just looked away from her. Letitia kept asking where he lived and if he was lost, what he was doing in the dark woods in this weather, but the boy was still silent. She wondered why he didn't say anything, and then thought, what if suddenly he couldn't talk? Or maybe he was deaf and couldn't hear her. Then Letitia gestured and said with her lips that this place was very dangerous. But again there was no response from the boy. The girl did not understand how they could talk to each other and what she should do. She didn't understand how he'd ended up so far away in the mountains and without any adults. His clothes look expensive. She thought he was probably from some rich family. Then Letitia asked the boy if he had run away, but the boy again said nothing. He just stood there looking at her. The girl realized that she had to go back, because the rain was not going to stop. She picked up her basket and stood up, thinking that even though she'd only gotten 5 petals, it was more important to get down from the mountains with this child. She looked at the trembling boy and thought that Mom and Dad would understand her. After all, they say that it is the duty of the strong to help the weak and troubled. She just decided that the next day she would go and dig up 15 petals in order to collect the previous day's ration as well. She took his hand and told him to get down from the mountains soon, because it was very dangerous and a bear might show up at any minute. And at that moment Letitia heard some rustling in the bushes again. She quickly grabbed his arm and pulled him down, shouting that they had to run. Then the children ran through the forest. The girl noticed that the rain was getting heavier and heavier, and they had to get down quickly to be safe. But lo and behold, as she was coming down the hill, she failed to notice the rock and, not unintentionally, twisted her foot. Letitia, who continued to hold the boy's hand, fell to the ground, and he with her. For a while the girl lay down because her leg was in great pain, and then she remembered the basket. She immediately jumped up and started looking around for her medicine basket. Then she looked to the side and found it after all. Letitia walked over and picked up her unfortunate 5 petals, which were torn and softened by the impact. Tears came to the girl's eyes because she realized that now there was no medicine to be made from them. But at that moment a boy came up to her along with a handkerchief and started wiping her tears. Letitia was surprised. She looked at his sad look, then took his hands and thanked him. She looked away and thought she'd have to pull herself together and find a way to get out first. She looked up at the top of the cliff and realized that they had fallen from there, and there was no way to get down any further. Then she turned around and looked up, wondering if she could get up by stepping on one of the pebbles. But at that moment the boy grabbed her by the sweater and shouted the word down. Letitia was very surprised and asked what down meant. She thought it meant that he could talk after all, and at that moment the girl heard a great rumbling of stones, and when she looked up, she saw that they were falling right on top of them, and in the place where she had been standing a second ago, the rocks came crashing down and stopped. Letitia was shocked. She thought she'd almost been crushed by those rocks. If it hadn't been for the boy, she would have been gone. The girl gave him a quick hug and thanked him for warning her of the danger. The boy was embarrassed. Then he said the word basket, and Letitia remembered that she had almost been crushed like that basket. If it hadn't been for him, it would have ended badly. Then she asked what his name was, and gave her name. The boy was still silent. Letitia smiled and said that if it was hard for him, he didn't have to talk. It was all right. She thought it meant that he was just late in learning to talk. And at that moment, the boy said, dangerous. Letitia was surprised and asked what was dangerous, but he was only repeating the word. The girl, couldn't understand what he meant. Then the boy took her in his arms and hugged her. She thought that was probably what he wanted. Letizia noticed that he was cold because he was very wet because of the rain. At that moment, she started to take off her jacket and said that if he was cold, he could just say so. Then she put the jacket on him, and the boy said the word Cerberus. Letitia was surprised to hear it. She didn't understand why he was talking about a three-headed dog, but at that moment the stranger began to take her off. The girl screamed and told him not to do it because it was very cold. Then he stepped closer to her and slipped the other side over her shoulders. Now they were close together, but under the same jacket. That's how they sat for a while on the grass, wrapped up in one thing. After a while, Letitia looked at the boy and said he was very tempting. He got a little embarrassed and, lowering his eyes, said the word morning. The girl was surprised. She didn't understand a little what he was saying it for, but then she assumed and asked, "Didn't I say that to him before?" He answered nothing to this, and his cheeks showed a flush. Letitia realized that apparently she had been right after all, but she doesn't understand why she feels as if this isn't the first time she's had this conversation. And then suddenly, thinking, she realized that she knew someone who looked a lot like this child, sometime before this situation, when Letitia was still at home and breakfast was served. Suddenly her brother started to get up, and she asked in surprise, "What happened?" The boy of the evil dream said the soup was so bland you couldn't eat it. When she heard these words, she was very surprised, took the salt shaker and asked if she could pass the salt to him. But at this point her brother got very angry and asked if she was dumb and didn't realize what he was saying. The soup was too watery. He wouldn't eat it. After he yelled at the girl, took the loaf of bread and started to walk away, shivered. "Bon appetit, everyone." Then Letitia was very upset because it was her bread, and when she told him so, her brother answered her that he had more studying to do. So let her be quiet, and biting into his bread, he said she really pissed him off. The girl said in a lowered tone that she hadn't even had a proper breakfast after all, and hoped she would be able to now. But at that moment her conversation was interrupted by someone's scream. It was a woman's voice, and it was calling for the girl. Letitia immediately went to her room, and when the door opened, she asked her grandmother if something was wrong. The older woman sat down on the bed. She didn't manage it very quickly, but she told the girl that it looked like rain was coming. Letitia was very surprised when she heard this, and said that it was no good if it rained, we should just close the windows. Then the grandmother shouted at her granddaughter, and asked if she didn't understand at all. She said her bones were breaking very badly. The girl was very surprised. But then the elderly woman continued, and said that it was already time for her to die. Why go on living? Her knees were breaking, and there was no one to even make a compress. Letitia immediately ran to the door and told her grandmother that it was saying that she would bring it all in now, and her knees would go away in a flash. Then the girl finished reminiscing and thought that they were alike, but at the same time completely different. This child doesn't force her to fulfill her whims or yell at her for any reason. At that moment, the boy rested his head on her shoulder. She took his hand. Letitia felt an incredible warmth emanating from it, and closed her eyes for a moment. At that minute, the whole night had passed. Already the sun was beginning to come out from behind the horizon and start its new day. The children suddenly heard someone's voice calling Mr. Mikael. Letitia opened her eyes first and wondered who Mr. Michael was. Then she looked at the boy, who was also awake, and asked if they were looking for him. Then there was another shout that said Mikael's name. The boy shuddered when he heard it. Letitia smiled and said that it was so, he had escaped after all. Her words were interrupted by the same voice asking where Mr. Mikael was. But he said nothing, and she realized it was just the way it was. A child from a rich family. So young, and already running away. Then she looked at him again and thought that, judging from his address, he was from a noble family with a high title. Then she moved closer to him and whispered in his ear, asking if he was an aristocrat. Of course, Mikael didn't answer anything, but just sat there staring at one point. Then the girl thought that meant yes, and decided she had to get him back before the villagers were disturbed. At that moment, she turned toward the mountain and began shouting to get attention, and the man who had been shouting Mikael's name all this time, hearing her voice, shouted to his assistant that he was there. Then Letitia turned to the boy and told him that he could go home now, and asked that he not run away again, for his parents were worried. Mikael didn't say anything to this, of course. He just continued to sit there and be silent. He was sad. After a while, the guards who were looking for Mikhail came down from the mountain. They immediately began to clean and care for the boy. Then one of the men approached the girl and asked her name. Letitia introduced herself and smiled at him. Then the man said that she had been with Mr. Mikhail and thanked her for it. But the girl said it was no big deal, and anyone would have done that in her place. Letitia looked at Mikhail, who was surrounded by people, and thought that she would really like to say goodbye to him, but apparently it would be very difficult. Then several carriages with people who had been looking for Mikhail all this time began to disperse into the woods. There was a commotion. Letitia, looking around, was surprised that so many people were looking for the boy. She stepped back a little and thought that everyone was looking for Mikhail, and probably no one had even remembered her in the meantime. But at that moment the girl was interrupted from her thoughts. It was a familiar voice, and it called her name. Letitia looked up and saw Mikhail in front of her. She was surprised, but the boy was reaching into his pocket and pulling out something. Then he put something in her hands and said, "Grave." The girl was very surprised to hear this word. She did not understand what he was saying. But then, looking into his big turquoise eyes, she realized he was saying it needed to be hidden. But at that moment the guards came up to the boy, and turning to him, told him not to cause much trouble. Then Mikhail, without a word, went to his carriage. But before he sat down, he swore and smiled at the girl. Letitia waved goodbye to him, and mentally said goodbye and wished him a happy life. At that moment, when the carriage had already left, she pulled out of her pocket what Mikhail had given her, and thought that her parents would be very happy when she told them, because the sale of this thing would pay for her brother's tuition. And at that moment the girl stopped herself at these thoughts, and thought that it was not right. The boy was very disturbed, and this thing must be dear to him, and it was very nice of her to do that. Letitia put it in her pockets and thought it was about time to go home, for Mommy and Daddy must be very worried. At that moment, the girl who stood in the middle of the forest and the boy who rode in the carriage wondered if they would ever meet again. It had been a whole year since then, and it was beautiful sunny weather outside. Letitia's parents were just leaving, and before they left they said they would be late, so she should make dinner for her grandmother and brother. The girl had grown so much over the year, but she still did her chores around the house the same way, so she said she would be sure to get everything done, and they could take it easy. Her mom thanked her and wished her a good day. Letitia smiled and then went to do her chores. She was now 14 years old. Her grandmother was still sick, and her brother Paddington spent days studying for an exam he was going to take in a few years. Her parents, as usual, left all the housework to her, and everything was the same from day to day. There was no variety for the girl. And just like that, last year's meeting in the mountains began to seem like a pleasant summer dream. But only one thing reminded her that it was all real, and that was the brooch he had given her. There, the brooch was the only proof that that meeting wasn't something her brain made up, but was real. When evening came, of course, Letitia was in the mountains gathering medicinal herbs for her grandmother. It was already starting to get dark, and the girl realized that she had finished early this time, so it was time for her to go back. Looking at the basket that already contained a lot of healing petals, she thought that she had collected enough this time, so the parents would be satisfied. But at that moment a drop fell on the girl's nose, and when she looked up she noticed that it was starting to rain. And in just a second, a heavy downpour came down on her. Letitia was shocked, but she thought she had to hurry before the rain got any worse. The girl covered the medicine with her jacket and started running towards home. At that moment lightning struck very close beside her. It scared her a little, but she did not stay and kept running. Suddenly the girl heard a great sound of thunder, and then she saw a bright flash. She fell to the ground in surprise. The lightning struck a tree that was very close to her. Letitia was shivering with fear and cold. She was a little alarmed by the coincidence, because the lightning seemed to be aiming straight at her. But she decided not to think about it, because she had to get down the mountain. The girl picked up a brooch that had fallen out of her pocket while she was fleeing a lightning bolt. But the second she touched the jewelry, a bolt of lightning struck straight at her. Letitia fell to the ground, letting go of the brooch. There was smoke coming from her because of the strong current. The girl was in a great deal of pain. She was trembling and didn't realize it had just happened. Letitia couldn't even move her arm. But at that moment a picture from the previous night appeared before her eyes. She remembered it clearly. It was her memory. Letitia thought she must be dying. with her whole life flashing before her eyes. It must be the end. And so, when Letitia's eyes were almost closed and she was already walking into the light, a picture surfaced before her eyes of a girl watching a huge truck come flying at her. At that moment, she realized she was already dying. It shocked her, but the girl remembered that this was a world from a novel she had read as an ordinary girl. Letitia Woods. She is the late younger sister of a corrupt official. She was a supporting character, and even when she became an adult, the whole family continued to exploit her without thinking of her daughter's needs and desires. Eventually, Letitia couldn't hold out much longer and fell ill, and soon she died. She's just an extra nobody pays attention to, and the girl now realized that she had become her. She thought it would be better if it wasn't true, but just a dream. But all this suffering and sorrow is not made up. It is real. It is what the future holds for her. When Letitia picked up the brooch, thinking that there was no way she wanted to die and would not sacrifice her life for some family that didn't even think of her. At this time in the city, her brother Paddington was walking outside with his friends. However, when he saw that the sun was already setting, he said it was getting late for him to go. The guys tried to talk him down and told him to play some more, because his sister does all the housework without his help. So there's no reason for him to be back so early. Paddington smiled and said it was her responsibility, and he was going to the academy after all. At this point, Letitia finally reached the settlement. She poured water into a bucket to wash away the dirt, and as the girl walked by without touching anyone, Paddington elbowed her and told her to back off. Sister, wiping her face with a wet rag, said she would only wash herself, for she was going to Sevron today and had gotten very dirty in the forest. Paddington smirked and said that she had a reason to cut her hair. She looked like a tramp anyway, and asked if she thought she would be better off with short hair. Letitia ignored his words. Then the boy went on and said that their lunch had been nothing, and asked that at least she should make dinner properly. The girl, after listening to him in a quiet but stern voice, replied that she would not do it. Paddington, on hearing this, was very much surprised, and asked what she was saying, how it would not cook. However, his sister said she wouldn't cook dinner and looked at him angrily. She turned away from him and said that she was very tired, and while she was collecting medicine for her grandmother, she almost hurt herself badly, so she would go to sleep. The boy was indignant, and asked what she meant by she was tired and wouldn't cook. It means that she thinks everyone should starve to death because she is tired. Then Letitia looked angrily at her brother and told him to set the table himself in that case. Paddington, hearing this, was horrified. He asked, "Has she gone mad or what? How can I set the table?" At this point, the girl thought that it would be better for him not to enter the academy, because no matter how hard he tried, but by taking bribes, he would become just an idiot who destroys the country. When she looked at him, she just chuckled, and then she dipped her face into the bucket of water she'd collected. At this time, Paddington came up to her and pulled her away from the wind. The girl could not keep on her feet and fell, but she paid it no mind and asked, "Does he still need water?" Paddington got angry and called her a damn girl, said she was just crazy while she was in those woods. He started to leave and added that since she dared to be impertinent to him, he would tell his parents everything. When evening came, Letitia was already in her cell and about to go to bed, when suddenly her parents came into her room. They came closer to the girl, and the mother said they had learned all about it from Paddington. He said she had been rude to her grandmother. Then the father intervened and asked Letitia why she did it. "Because you can't take out your anger on your family because it's hard." The girl apologized. However, the father went on and said that she was still young, so she didn't know that the older she got, the harder it was, and everyone had a much harder time than she did. But they just put up with it. He patted her on the head and told her that everyone can make mistakes, so they forgive her for the first time. But she has to go apologize to her older brother and grandmother. Letitia got up from the bed. She was silent for a while. After that, she had the courage to say that she was having a hard time. At first it was very quiet, but when her parents questioned her and she started to speak louder, even screaming, saying she was having a very hard time. She said she was the first one up at dawn because she had to get dinner ready before they left, and from morning till night, she goes to the mountains in all weathers and gathers Sevron. And when she comes back, all tired, she has to do her accumulated chores at home. At this point, her mother came closer to her and hugged her daughter, apologizing and saying that she didn't know she was taking things this way. Letitia was shocked because her parents had not shown any feelings towards her before. But her mother kept hugging her and asked if their daughter was having such a hard time. The girl hugged her back, and her tears flowed. She could no longer hold back her emotions. At that moment, she thought that, of course, her parents were not like that. But at least her mom was something. They stood like that for a while longer. After that, Mom moved away, trying to tear her tears with her handkerchief. Letitia said it was all right now. Her mother looked at her and replied that was very good. Then she could go and apologize to her older brother and grandmother. Letitia was shocked. She asked her mother if she was really saying that. But the woman was outraged and asked her daughter how she could be angry just because she sided with her brother and grandmother. Then the mother sighed heavily and said that she thought her daughter had figured it all out, but apparently she hadn't. Father agreed with her, and afterwards he looked at Letitia and told her to go and apologize at once, especially to Paddington. He then asked if she still didn't realize what she had done wrong, and asked her to stop acting like a little kid already, and not to think that crying would help her get her way. Then Mom said she knew she was having a hard time and asked if she remembered how she always bragged about her. No one has a child as kind as Letitia. Everyone has their own problems, and Paddington and Grandma and Mommy and Daddy all work much harder than she does. Letitia, hearing this, was surprised. She asked if they were saying that everyone worked harder than she did. The girl couldn't stand it and screamed, telling them to give Paddington her job in that case, and she would study in his place. Dad got angry and asked what she was saying when Mom also joined the conversation, and said that she had made Dad angry, so let her apologize immediately. Letitia interrupted them and asked if they were laboring for her and not the other way around. She asked who in this house does anything at all for her. She is the only one who works to serve every member of the family. Father said he thought Paddington was exaggerating, but now he sees that he wasn't. He doesn't know where she got it, but now she's under house arrest. Letitia asked, what about Sevron? After all, she had dug up far more than her grandmother needed. But why is it always not enough? Or is it also a lie? At this point, the father couldn't take it anymore. He slapped the girl on the cheek without saying anything. But the girl didn't cry. She looked at them and said that if it wasn't a lie, then let them explain why she didn't need to dig Sevron now. Dad said she had a long tongue. And then he asked who told her that. The girl replied that she couldn't say. The father became even more angry. He was about to hit her again and asked if it was the mountain keeper or the hunter. Who told her that? His wife tried to calm him down. Then he said that until she had thought it over, she should not dare to leave her room. Letitia at this point thought she had decided to try her luck. However, this is life. Just as it was, nothing new. As she clenched her fists in anger but still said before her parents left that she sincerely apologized, her mind briefly clouded. Tears came to her eyes and she said that she had made a terrible mistake that could not be fixed with a few words, and what she should do. She doesn't know at all. At this point, her mother came up to her and said their good daughter don't need her to be so upset. Let her just do as well as before. It's not hard after all. Letitia was happy and said that this is her daily work. However, she wants to help even more. She wants to earn money, to invest in Paddington's tuition. Dad was shocked to hear this. However, the girl's mom said that she is still a child, so let her not think about it yet. It is enough for them that she helps around the house. Letitia said she had recently heard that Jennifer had become a maid to the Viscount, and the girl was even younger than herself. She also added that she has come to her senses because of their words. She was so stupid all this time, but now she wants to be useful to the family. At this point, my father thought, he hadn't yet figured out what he would do if he couldn't make any more money from Sevron. Then he went to his daughter and told her that if she would try harder, they would be very happy and help in any way they could. At that moment, Paddington came into my room through the open door. He heard them talking. The guy thought she was just an idiot, but he was still very successful at accusing her. The next day, Letitia Woods went to the city, and there became a maid in the richest family in the village. The master knew that she was capable of working for 2 adults, so he assigned even a very generous salary. The Woods family thought of the money their daughter would send monthly was beyond happy. However, their dreams were shattered within a month, because Letitia Woods, when she barely received her first paycheck, immediately disappeared without a trace. As soon as she was hired, Letitia went straight to Baron Jefferson's mansion. The maid who was supposed to hire her said she didn't even look 16. However, the girl said that it was just that everyone in her family was short. The maid replied that they were not in a position to choose after all. The maid then handed her the papers and asked if she could sign them. Letitia was very lucky, and she thought it was very good that she was literacy trained, so she wouldn't be able to give herself away. The maid said that by contract all her wages would be forfeited if she left before 3 months, and if she escaped she could never enter these lands. She replied that she understood everything and that she had no further questions. Then she began to sign the papers. At that moment, the maid thought that this girl would be useful. As the blonde maid walked past them, the woman turned to her. Her name was Beth, and asked if she could take the new girl with her. Beth immediately stopped and asked where to place her. The maid replied that any available space was fine. Then the fair-haired maid turned to Letitia and told them to go quickly because work was not waiting. As they walked, Letitia thought about the fact that she didn't even know where to go if she wasn't welcome at the mansion. But she was glad that the market maids had not deceived her. Then Beth turned to the girl and said that she had put 2 years on top of her own after all. However, the girl said she couldn't find a place that would hire a girl, even though a maid was very much needed. Beth said she didn't care, if she was confident. Let her try her best to get accepted without recommendations because they were short on manpower. Letitia replied that of course she would try, and the maid added that if she could keep it up for 3 months, only then would she believe. Beth turned to the girl and told her to choose between cleaning or cooking. Letitia thought it over and said she really liked cooking. Letitia has decided to make money in this house until she grows up and then open a cafe or restaurant. She wants to work in the kitchen and learn different recipes. It would be really great to become a chef and give people happiness through food. At this point, however, Beth said she would do the cleaning. Letitia felt a little hurt. However, she didn't let it show and said that she liked cleaning too. After that, the maid started looking at the girl and said that they usually pay for uniforms, but since she was small, she didn't even know what would fit her. If they find one that fits, she'll take it. Letitia thanked, and afterward the maid took her to her room and said fine, then she should hold on and try her best. Letitia found herself in a lovely room with a very beautiful interior. Then she saw a woman in front of her who was also in a maid's uniform, and immediately said hello to her. The woman said her name was Gala Ender, and then she pointed to the mirror, telling her to go wipe it thoroughly. After that they went to another room. When they were finished, the maid said that when she was done with her work, she could rest for a while. Letitia, scrubbing the floors, asked where she would sleep. Gala replied that they had 1 room for 4, and she could take any empty bed. The girl liked it. She figured she could clean, so it wasn't even bad for a start, and if she lasted, she'd have a chance to get into a coveted place. At this time, there was a debate going on in the imperial palace. Some man was yelling at his assistant, saying he couldn't take it anymore and would rather talk to the wall. The latter, however, turned to Sir Genet and told him to have a little patience. However, the man still blended in and said that even walls have ears, so he asked that the man be careful with his words. Sir Genet turned to Jorge and told him to save himself quickly, because if he believed in this fool of a crown prince, he would one day lose his head or end up on the streets. However, Jorge objected and said that His Majesty Mikael was not a fool at all. The man smirked and said there was only one person in the world who thought that. And then he left. Jorge at this point thought he was just an idiot. That's why scientists are useless and some bookworm who didn't hold a sword. Unknowingly loyal. Jorge doesn't understand how His Highness the Crown Prince can be considered a fool. They're just fools. And His Highness's father, his past master, was smarter than anyone in the empire. He was a distant relative of the emperor, but he lived in affluence and even claimed the throne. However, Mr. Horge and his wife died under strange circumstances and on the orders of His Majesty the Emperor. His Highness Mikael was secretly raised in a country house in the province away from all prying eyes. Horge thought that if he had been raised by a nanny instead of mercenaries who showered him with love, this wouldn't have happened before. And in that moment, the man remembered his first encounter with His Highness Mikael. He introduced himself and said he was a servant of His Majesty Emperor Anthony, and he ordered the boy to be escorted to his palace. George also told His Highness that from now on his name is Mikael Sonnet Devrant, and he is the crown prince of this empire. Then the boy said only one word, tree. Jorge was very surprised. He did not understand what he was saying. And when he returned to his office, he began berating the workers, asking how they could have withheld such a thing. One of the men said as they reported, "His Majesty the Emperor always answered personally." Jorge asked, "And what did he say then?" Then they replied that everything should be left as it was. At that moment, the man came back to reality from his memories and thought it was too late for regrets. And no matter how much you think about it, you can't change anything. Then he was walking towards Mikhail's office. When he went in to see him, he immediately apologized for allowing such a person in. He immediately threw him out. However, Mikhail said only one word, "Letitia," and repeated it time after time. Some time passed, and Letitia continued to work at Baron Jefferson's mansion. The girls found a uniform after all. One day she was approached and called out to her while she was doing her work. The girl immediately asked, "What's wrong?" It was Beth, and she said that the kitchen was short-handed so she could go and help. Letitia, hearing this, was immediately happy. She had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The maid told the girl to leave everything to Hallie and get ready. Letitia thanked her. She was glowing with happiness. In fact, something changed after a week of her stay at Baron Jefferson's mansion. And eventually she did end up in the kitchen, just as she'd wanted from the start. And there she made friends with the maids. She was very embarrassed, actually. Letitia came to Gala and told her that she was being sent to the kitchen, so she was leaving everything to her. The woman was surprised and congratulated her, because she had wanted it for a long time. The girl thought that she was not the same now as she had been in the past. She worked as much as she could, and always did everything perfectly, so that she couldn't be picked on. Letitia hadn't even shown half of her skills, but the maids already admired and were well disposed toward her. She used to avoid compliments, no matter how sincere, because she was fed up with the family's praise and actually didn't know what she was even doing. After all, her parents certainly praised her for her work. However, it was very insincere and always for the sake of ticking boxes. However, it's real now. Beth rewards the girl, she just praises. Letitia thought that this was just the beginning, and if she mastered cooking, she could earn money by selling food, and finally, to change her life. She's going to squeeze as much as she can out of the kitchen to learn everything she can. Jorge couldn't understand who Mikhail was talking about, but after a while he remembered. He was talking about the girl they had met in the forest, and he asked if his master was referring to the red-haired girl from the mountains. Mikhail said again, just saying her name. Then Jorge was surprised, and asked if he really needed her. And at that moment, the man reflected that at last he could now understand him, and he decided for himself that he could swear on his honor. But he would still find this girl for the Lord. Letitia by then had already arrived in the kitchen. She was met by the mansion's chef, a girl named Luce. When she saw the girl, she was very surprised. She couldn't understand what kind of child she was, all skin and bones, and how such a skinny girl could even work in the kitchen. Letitia thought she had lived this before and apologized, but Luce didn't listen to her. She turned to Amelia and asked her to bring the apple pie that was left over from lunch. The cook did so. The pie was very flavorful and appetizing looking, directly beckoning Letitia. Luz looked at the girl and said she was already drooling, so let her stop just looking and sit down and eat. Then the girl sat down to eat apple pie and thought she was too skinny, so she would probably be returned to cleaning as soon as she was full. But she liked the apple pie very much. She had not eaten such delicious food for a long time, because at home she had always had to save money and eat everything bland. Then she turned to the chef and said it was the first time she had ever eaten such good food. Luce smiled and said she would have liked it even more. After all, it was made by a professional. The woman also added that in order to taste it, she would have to become a maid first. Letitia still couldn't believe that she was actually allowed to eat it. Then Luce looked at her playfully and asked her if she didn't eat. Then who would work in the kitchen? Letitia thanked her and began to eat even faster. Then the woman was surprised and told her not to hurry, for no one would take him away. In the past life, the girl did not know how to cook, so she often spent all her money on food. But in this life, she decided to learn to cook a lot of dishes and be sure to open a good restaurant. At this time, in the village where Letitia lived, her family summoned a knight. Her mother sounded very worried and asked him to find her daughter. The woman told the knight that if he found it, she would do anything. She had tears in her eyes. The grandmother, who was standing nearby, was crying and saying that it was all her fault, and it was time for her to go to the other world. Then the man interjected, "Does that mean Letitia Woods has left home?" The father had already intervened in the conversation. He shouted and said that their daughter was not like that at all. She had definitely fallen for the trick of some bastard. Then the knight scratched his head and said that this turns out to be neither kidnapping nor murder, and asked if he had understood correctly. Letitia's mother had already started to ask the knight how it was possible to talk about such terrible things. However, he interrupted her and asked how the girl had disappeared. The woman said her daughter is very kind and she loves the family. She promised to come home the first weekend and it's already been a week. She is said to have boarded a carriage to Tatum, and she really hopes nothing bad happens. At this point, the knight thought that Tatum was the nearest town in the village. However, the woman went on and said that they had spent all the money to look for her in the town, but never found her. The knight asked, "And how old was her daughter?" The woman replied that she had just recently turned 14. Then he thought about it and realized that she could not work as a maid at that age. There are cases when poor people sell their young daughters to men. It is clear to him that these people do not love their daughter as much as they say they do. It's not uncommon for a provincial girl who can't bear the burden to run away after barely getting her first paycheck. And Letitia Woods' parents are straining to find her, certainly not out of any love for their daughter. So he decides there's no point in dealing with them anymore and starts to leave. It was a mystery to him where she had gone. After all, a girl could only get a job as a maid. The couple must have checked Tatum's mansion, but if they hadn't found her there, she was in another city. The knight thought for a moment. Just the face of the place where a provincial girl with no education ran away from her parents. The capital of the empire is the city of Tiaz. Yuna, the prince he swore to serve his whole life, asked for something for the first time. Therefore, Horj must never disappoint him, but fulfill on the contrary the boy's request. Just like that, a month passed. Letitia, towards evening, finished washing the dishes. When she said so, the cook replied that she had done a good job again, so she could go eat. Letitia sat down at the table and began to eat her dinner, thinking about the fact that she had been working in the kitchen for a month now, but she hadn't even touched the bread dough, let alone a knife. She didn't understand. Was she still not trusted? But when she tasted a bite of her dinner, she thought it was very tasty, so there was no need to jump to conclusions. When Luz noticed that the girl started to eat quickly, she told her to take her time or she'd get indigestion. The girl laughed awkwardly, and then she continued. Then the chef asked her to answer one question. Why was she so drawn to the kitchen? Letitia replied that she really wanted to learn how to cook. The woman then said that it was just as she had thought, and afterward added that she was probably disappointed that she hadn't even touched the knife once. Letitia lowered her head and said that there was a little of that. Liz was very surprised and asked how it was a little. The girl then explained that she was very upset at first, but the food she is given is very good, so she has stopped just thinking about it and is enjoying what she has. When the cook heard this, she laughed loudly. Then the girl was surprised and asked if she'd said something wrong. Liz, wiping away tears of laughter, said no, and asked if it was really as good as she said it was. Letitia replied that of course, to the extent that she was even happy. But at that moment, the woman told her not to wash dishes from tomorrow. When the girl heard this, she was very surprised and asked what she meant. But then Luz said onions first. No, still, they would start by peeling potatoes and learning how to cook. Letitia heard this and shone with joy. She could not believe her happiness that she would be allowed to cook, but she also said that the girl must work hard. Letitia replied that in that case she would work even 10 times harder. As it was getting dark outside, Baron Jefferson was sitting in his office discussing his problems with the girl. The man asked indignantly why the hell he didn't understand why the man was coming to them. The girl, however, replied that there must be a reason for it, but the Baron said that they knew it in principle. He also added that they would only be able to entertain him to the best of their ability. If the maids were more capable, there would be less trouble. The girl who sat next to him was Baroness Jefferson, and she said he wasn't coming right away. So they have a convenient occasion to bring up all the ignoramuses. Then the man sat down in a chair and told her to get someone from her entourage, because no servant could be entrusted with the care of such an important guest. The Baroness said quite herself that that was the way to do it, and when she looked at her husband, she asked if he was sorry. The Baron replied that, of course not, and he thought that after the death of his elder brother, he had become a baron, and hoped to enter the circle of the city aristocracy. But because of the mourning period, he can't even be invited to a simple reception, let alone a ball. The Baron said in a quiet voice that his arrival was their chance, but he still can't figure out his motive, why he wants to do this. The next day, when all the workers of the house were sitting around the table eating, suddenly a boy burst in and called out to the lady cook. The woman turned around in surprise, and when she saw him, she asked what was wrong. The boy, all out of breath from running, replied that the mistress had ordered the most sumptuous dinner of all to be prepared. Luce smiled at this moment and realized that apparently a noble guest was coming to visit them. However, the boy shouted out, saying that His Highness's close confidant, Crown Prince Sir George, was coming. One of the maids dropped her cup in shock. Luce was surprised and said it was rather sudden, since they usually give a whole week's notice. Letitia, who was standing nearby and heard it all, thought, "Is this really the Sir Jorge she is thinking of? He is a crony of the most ruthless emperor in history, Jorge Balmer, the late emperor, who had lost several children in a bitter struggle for the throne, appointed Michael Sonnet d'Avrant, who had no parents at all, a dummy heir until the true heir grew up. The crown prince took the oath of allegiance from Sir Jorge. However, on the eve of the coming-of-age ceremony, the emperor's successor suddenly died, and Crown Prince Mikhail, having barely ascended the throne, began to go mad. Sir Jorge was the only man who was capable of appeasing the ruthless emperor. His word was capable of changing a death sentence to life imprisonment in an underground prison, and when Jorge was assassinated for political reasons at the age of 50, no one could stop the sovereign anymore. Until one day Emperor Mikhail himself was assassinated. At that moment Letitia remembered that that noble boy was also named Mikhail. It was so strange that a tyrant and a gentle child had the same name. However, she could not understand why the emperor's crony was going to the baron. She was certainly in the kitchen, and if something happened to the baron, she would be safe. Everything was fine now. Emperor Mikhail's true face would only show after he ascended the throne. And so, after some time, Jorge finally arrived. He got off near the manor, and Letitia thought he was finally there. Letitia decided that if she didn't get involved, she had nothing to worry about. When Jorge got out of the wagon, Letitia thought it was a very good thing that it had been quite easy to find her. A 14-year-old country girl in the capital can only work as a maid, and the search was immediately successful. It was worth searching among the estates in need of laborers. In order not to cause trouble to His Highness, the lad thought it necessary to send her to the palace with all the formalities. And Baron Jefferson was the man for the job. He is willing to marry even a commoner woman to a distant relative, if it will allow him to associate himself with the upper class. And Letitia Woods will enter the palace as a maid without any trouble, and then His Highness's wish will finally be fulfilled. Mikhail would not become another of His Majesty's toys. It was chaos in the kitchen of the manor, with everyone running from place to place and scrambling to get everything ready. Someone had to reach, someone had to chop, someone had to fry something. The work was in full swing, and no one could rest. Letitia, who was sitting in the corner peeling potatoes, thought it was the first time she had been so intensely busy. However, if a high-ranking guest is coming, the arrival is usually announced a few days in advance. But she still couldn't accept the fact that the Crown Prince's crony would suddenly show up in such a place. She knows the Crown Prince isn't real, but she didn't understand if it was so much to visit some baron. But at that moment someone in the kitchen shouted violently. Letitia even dropped a potato out of surprise. Then the chef asked what was wrong. One of the maids pointed to the closet and said the silverware was missing. Then all the girls crowded around the cabinet and were shocked. Luz, in an indignant voice, said that it was the most beautiful set for welcoming important guests. Then she turned to Emily and asked that she inform Mistress. Emily objected and said that she was already out of place, for it was a great responsibility to have Sir Jorge as a guest. Luz immediately interrupted her and said that she just didn't know Mistress's character. If she doesn't inform now, she'll whip the calves out of all of them, and that's not all. She'll strip everyone naked and make them look for that service. The maid got worried and asked, what if they told now? Wouldn't they be undressed? However, the chef explained that Knight Jorge was in the manor now, so the lady would not do that and told her to hurry up already. Concerned, Emily immediately ran out of the kitchen and ran to alert her mistress that she was missing. At that moment, Luce sighed and said she had been wondering why it had been so quiet lately. The cook came over to her and said that apparently more than half of the newcomers would be leaving this time. But at that moment there came the concerned voice of a maid saying that silverware was missing and asking why they weren't doing anything. Luce turned to her and told her that she didn't have to worry. They would just clean up. The girl was surprised, however, and asked what she meant by clean up. The chef explained that when newcomers are trained in the kitchen, something is bound to go missing. The mistress knows perfectly well who the thief is. The girl was horrified. She asked, but in that case, why go so far? Luz laughed and said she was such an underdog, and asked if she thought she'd last more than a month on the estate. But after a while, the Baroness came into their kitchen. She immediately turned to the chef and asked, is it really true that the silver service has been stolen? Luz said that was indeed the case. Then the Baroness sighed heavily and asked, what on earth is this? Madame said that we need to find the culprit immediately, or he will escape and it will end badly. However, she does not know how to do it. After all, they already have Sir Jorge as a guest, and he mustn't find out about it. Luz replied to the lady that if you wait for Sir Jorge to leave, the thief will just run away and sell the service. Then she wondered if it might be a good idea to ask Jorge for understanding and take on the task of finding the culprit. She thought it would be a good idea to start with places where the service might have been hidden. Letitia, upon hearing this, was shocked. She didn't understand how they wanted to ask for the understanding of the Crown Prince's close confidant. At that moment, the Baroness looked back and said she had investigated. Expect, after all, a criminal in their midst. Los said it wasn't necessary. The last time the silverware was wiped down was last night. The lady sighed heavily and said that she is illiterate and therefore does not understand anything. But she talks about probability. At that moment, the maids began to whisper. One of them asked why everything had gone wrong on this particular day when the guest arrived. The other did not know what to do now. When the mistress left, Luz clapped her hands a few times to get the workers' attention. Afterwards, I turned to them and asked why they were standing idle. It's just that the silver service had disappeared. Is there no food for Knight Jorge to serve? After that, she ordered them to prepare ordinary dishes right away. Letitia returned to her peeling potatoes after these words, and thought that the unexpected guest and the disappearance of the silverware her mind was at ease, so the work would not be spoiled. At that moment, the butler came in and called Letitia to them. The girl was very frightened. She did not understand what was happening, and she asked, "What's wrong?" However, the man silently approached her and started pulling her arm. The girl did not understand what he was doing. However, he said that telling right there would only hurt her, and asked if she realized that. Letitia was surprised. She didn't understand what was going on or why the secrecy. Then they went upstairs. When the door opened, the man said he had brought Letitia Woods. However, when she saw the Baron in the room, she thought, does he really think she's a thief? Letitia sat down on her knees before him and said that she had not been near the silverware all day, had been with Mistress, the cook, and he could ask her if he did not believe her. However, the Baron replied in a calm voice that he had not called her because of the service. The girl asked in surprise, "Why then?" He pulled a piece of jewelry out of his pocket and said it was a brooch, found in her bed. At that moment, Letitia looked up and recognized it. It was the same brooch that Mikhail had given her then. She thought she had hidden it under her mattress so she wouldn't lose it while she was working, and wondered if it had been found while they were looking for the set. The girl said at once that she had not stolen it. The Baron replied, "That means the brooch is hers," and asked from whom she had received it then. Letitia looked away from him and replied that she didn't know. The man smiled and asked, she didn't know. That is, she didn't know the owner of the thing. The girl replied that she had. Then the Baron said that she had better say that she had just found it. However, Letitia objected and said that if she found it, she would try to return it to its real owner, because you can't keep such expensive things for yourself. Then the Baron said after a while of silence that so be it, he would believe her. He came close to her and said that if she answered honestly, she would believe him. and asked how she had obtained the brooch. The girl was silent for a while, and then, stammering, answered that she had helped in the mountains as a child. When the man heard this, he smiled wickedly and said that she had confessed after all. Letitia was surprised and asked what he was talking about. Then the Baron asked, "Doesn't she realize this brooch couldn't have gotten to her?" Letitia replied that she knew. Then the man asked, "Really?" After a little thought, the girl said that he must have misunderstood her. And just as she was about to speak, they were suddenly interrupted because someone came into the room. They were the maids. At their head was Beth, and she addressed the Baron at once. All the women were in earnest. The Baron looked at them in surprise and asked what else they needed. Then Beth spoke up and said that she vouched that the girl would not have the courage to steal. She doesn't know why the council. He suddenly decided to question Letitia. But he was tricked after all. After that, the chef came forward and said that the girl had been with her all day, and after that she went straight back to her room. Then the girl behind Luce spoke up and said she was Letitia's neighbor. Their beds were next to each other. She would have noticed her suspicious behavior. Letitia was shocked. She didn't expect everyone to suddenly come to her defense. After all, she had never had this before. At this point, the Baron interrupted them all and said that he had heard them. Now let them go. But Beth objected and said they would only leave with Letitia. Then the chef spoke and said that the kitchen was woefully short of hands, and they certainly couldn't do it without Letitia in order to prepare the festive banquets in honor of Sir Jorge's arrival.